Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Vancouver Aquarium and welcome to our Sea Monsters Revealed lecture series. This morning's program, it's called Monster Brain, The Mysterious Lives of Octopuses. And 2 years ago, I was lucky enough to go to the island of Moorea in French Polynesia with a team of octopus scientists, as well as world-renowned author Cy Montgomery, who has published 20 books, swam with pink dolphins and piranhas, electric eels, great white sharks, and octopuses. And I'm so honored that this team is here this morning to tell you a little bit more about our adventures. So I'd like to introduce to you Cy Montgomery.
Thank you so much, Keely. It's thrilling to be here today. This is a day that we've looked forward to for 2 years. And I'd like to tell you about how this book came about, a book that we're launching here today at the Vancouver Aquarium. It's a book for younger readers, but it actually began with another book for adults, and the story of our expedition is in this book as well. Well, my odyssey began at the New England Aquarium, where I met a wonderful octopus named Athena. You all may know how interactive and unusually smart octopuses are, but I was rather unprepared because, remember, I'm a civilian. I'm just a writer, I'm not a scientist. And when I first met Athena, the giant Pacific octopus at the New England Aquarium, I was astounded to see that when the keeper opened the lid to her exhibit, how she turned red with emotion and slid over to greet me, and how her silvery eye swiveled in its socket to meet mine. And she came over and she let me pet her head. Well, I'd never had an interaction like that with a cephalopod. I'd never really known a mollusk who was that cognizant. Now remember, octopuses are so unlike us. Their body plan is utterly different. I mean, we are terrestrial vertebrates. They are marine invertebrates. We go head, body, limbs. They go body, head, limbs. A lot of people think this is the head, but it isn't. These animals have 3 hearts and blue blood. They have a beak like a parrot. Their mouths are in their armpits. They have venom like a snake, and they have ink like an old-fashioned pen. So I was absolutely astonished that I could be friends with an octopus. And I spent 3 years getting to know the giant Pacific octopuses at New England Aquarium. During that time, I got to understand how they recognize individuals, which had been proven scientifically by Dr. Jennifer Mather, who is with us today and one of the stars of both of my books. She had shown that even when people are dressed identically, octopuses simply looking up through the water at their faces can tell who's who. And they will recognize which person fed them a delicious fish and which person touched them with a bristly stick, which they don't like. They very quickly learned to move towards the people who fed them and away from those who irritated them. And not only that, when they were irritated, sometimes they would recognize that person and blast them in the water with water from their jet, cold, freezing salt water right in the face. They have fantastic aim. Well, octopuses are so amazing because they have senses that we don't have, as you probably know. They can change color in 7/10 of a second. They can also change shape. They can pour their baggy, boneless body into a tiny crevice, almost like water. And they are very, very smart. Not only do they recognize individual humans, but they enjoy playing with the same toys you give your children. In the Octopus Enrichment Handbook that a lot of aquariums use, they recommend that you deploy Mr. Potato Head to amuse your octopus, or give them Legos. And at New England Aquarium, we gave them a series of interlocking boxes to play with. And as I got to know the octopuses at the New England Aquarium and recognized the individuals, soon I developed a great desire to meet them in the wild ocean. So I learned to scuba. And I went to a wonderful octopus symposium at the Seattle Aquarium where I met both Dr. Jennifer Mather and David Scheel. And little did I know, Keely Langford was there as well. And these people would prove to be the stars of a book that I would research with them in French Polynesia. Here's Dr. Jennifer Mather. She's forgotten her flowers today, but she will be speaking after me. And here's the paradise where we got to work. We were working at a facility known as Creobe. Here's its campus, where people have been studying the coral reefs around the island of Moorea and the animals who live there for longer than any other research station in the area. So let me introduce you to our scientific team. Dr. Mather was the eminence grise, the head of our group, but also Dr. David Scheel, who will be speaking right after Jennifer Mather. He is one of the world experts on giant Pacific octopus, and among his many accomplishments is he's the guy who figured out how do you radio collar someone with no neck. He managed to find a way to put a radio tracking device on these animals, and that is a hard thing to do when they've got 1,600 very dexterous suckers, so dexterous that they can even untie knots. And if you give an octopus an operation, a lot of times the vet will find all the surgical silt untied at the bottom of the tank. So David's a pretty smart guy. We also had Dr. Tatiana Leite, who was one of Jennifer's students. She's based in Brazil, and she has actually discovered new species of octopus. And she's with us in spirit today. And in addition to these terrific researchers, we had our eagle-eyed and beautiful, athletic, talented interpreter here at Vancouver Aquarium, who, interestingly, found most of our octopuses. So we were working in the shallows mostly. I had kind of thought that we would do a lot of diving, but it turns out we were working in very shallow waters. This shallow, in fact. We were constantly at risk of scraping our nipples off on all the coral skeletons and running into deadly stonefish. It was actually difficult to work in these shallows, but this is where Dr. Mather has found most of the octopuses that she has studied. We were looking specifically for Octopus cyanea, the blue octopus, and what we were investigating was what do they eat and why? One of the things that we needed to do was find their dens, find their foods, catalog those foods, and we also had to administer an octopus personality test to these animals. Now that sounds kind of wild and crazy. It probably raised a bunch of eyebrows when Dr. Mather developed a personality test for octopuses, but it was necessary to rank them from bold to shy. We've already learned that they are such individual animals that it made Dr. Mather wonder, does their personality affect their food choice? And this was part of what we were studying. We saw wonders everywhere we looked, but the first few days, although we saw sharks and amazing fish, we weren't finding octopus, and I had to draw one in the sand for our photographer. But soon enough, Jennifer promised me. She said, we have bloodhounds. We're going to find them. The octopuses start appearing to us. Now, at first, I was very frustrated because by the time I saw the octopus, all the scientists had looked at him and he'd already retreated into a hole, and all I saw were a bunch of suckers, which made me feel kind of like a sucker. But just before, a few days before we were leaving, I had the experience that I was desperate to have, and that was meeting a wild octopus in the wild and traveling around. This, you all are able to see. My husband is like, where's the octopus? But you can see the octopus right here. This was one we named Mary Lou. And she traveled around and showed us around her place. She was a bold octopus who was missing 3 of her arms, which they will regrow, as you know. But even after this horrible experience of losing 3 of her arms, she was incredibly bold, and she almost seemed to be showing us all of her talents. She turned different colors, she grew spots, she showed us ocelli, which are different kinds of eyes. She showed us how she used the interbrachial web to hunt. She fished into crevices with her arms. And after we had spent, oh gosh, we were on octopus time, so I can't even tell you how long, finally David said, you know, I think we're wrecking her hunt. We better let her go. We let her go, but we have memorialized that day in our book, which is a tribute to what science is like in the field and a tribute to octopus's amazing intelligence. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Mather, who can speak in greater depth about her research on the subject.
Thank you, Sai. That was wonderful. It's actually quite a while ago that I began to study octopuses, and I'm a behaviorist, and behavior is what interests me. And I always loved all the mollusks, but when I came to the octopuses, I thought, boy, you're complicated. We don't know how intelligent they are. We don't know what kinds of things they're going to do. I wanted to find out. Mostly, we as humans, when we think of an intelligent animal, what we think about is us, monkeys, gorillas, dogs, maybe even crows, but we really don't think of an invertebrate as an intelligent animal. And that's, for me, what has been so interesting, because I've been saying, okay, so I can look at these animals, and they are in evolutionary, very distant group from us, so we can find out how intelligence evolved separate from the way it evolved in us. Octopuses solve problems. They find their way around the landscape. They have personalities, thanks, Sai's already told you. They actually do motor play. And they may have simple consciousness. I've been working on that. But I wanted to tell you a couple of studies that would give you some idea of how octopuses demonstrate their intelligence. And the first one that I'll mention is clams. So you have a clam in your hand, but you don't really have anything very much because it's still shut. So we would steam them and eat steamers, but the octopus doesn't have a stove, or if it does, so far, it hasn't learned how to use it. This is what you end up with after the octopus has been fed a bunch of clams. And notice they're nicely numbered and labeled. I was working with Roland Anderson in the Seattle Aquarium, and he would feed the clams to the octopuses. He'd send me to the shells, and I'd match the shells and look for the kind of damage. Interestingly enough, when we went one package, of course what we do is, you know, they said, well, what's the value of something going from the US to Canada? And he wrote down 0 because a bunch of broken shells doesn't mean anything to anybody. And the customs people said, what? How can you be sending a package worth 0? So after that, he said $10, and then the customs people were happy. Okay, the octopus has a Swiss Army knife. It can open a clam by simply yanking it apart, and remember, this is all underneath the arms. Or it has a beak like a parrot's, and it also has a radula, a tooth-covered organ that it can make holes in shells with. So if you give clam shells to the octopus, and then you look at the evidence, you can see some that have simply been yanked apart by the arms. You can see some that were broken, so they were yanked apart, but also they broke in the process. Or you can see some that the beak has chipped at the end of the valve, just enough space that it can inject a bit of poison, weaken the muscles, and open the clam. Or they also can make a very, very tiny hole in the side of the shell. And again, inject the poison, weaken the clam, here's dinner. Now, interestingly enough, when we fed them, look at the clams with the shell intact, and we found that they ate mostly the mussels and the Venus clams, which are relatively weak compared to the Protothaca clam, which is actually fairly strong. And so we thought, well, okay, what happens if we give them clams on the half shell? And if you give them clams on the half shell, it turns out they don't really like the mussels. Notice they hardly eat any of them. They really like the Prototheca. So it's a beautiful example of how the octopuses calculated, well, you know, it's going to take half an hour to get a steak dinner going. But hamburger is 5 minutes, so what the heck, I'll have hamburger. Okay? And you go to the restaurant, and the restaurant serves you the steak, so that's fine. Now, these chips, they're very tiny. They are actually very much at the anterior or the posterior of the clam. And you have to know a little bit about clam anatomy to understand that. But it turns out that the anterior and the posterior are where the retractor muscles are that hold the two valves together. So the octopus doesn't chip just any old place. It chips right where it can weaken the muscle as fast as possible, as efficiently as possible. So it doesn't just know, I've got a shell. It knows where on the shell I need to drill or I need to chip in order that it will be as easy as possible to get into the clam, okay? So it's not just choosing the techniques. It's also choosing the orientation and the location on the shell. And when you think about it, that's pretty good because the shell's underneath the arms. The octopus is not doing this by vision. It's doing this by touch, proprioception, okay? Now, another thing that octopuses are famous for doing is opening jars to get crabs inside. And that's pretty good because it's a nice manipulation, and you have to know how I can turn that and keep turning it so that I get the jar open. And octopuses are reasonably good at that. But we found that the giant Pacific octopuses needed a chemical reminder, that if we simply gave them the jar, vision only, they didn't usually remember to open the jar. If we put holes in the jar, and we put holes in the jar because we thought, well, maybe just enough chemical cues will circulate from the crab inside, but that didn't even do it. But if we gave them chemical cues on the outside of the jar and the crab inside the jar, then they would see the crab in the jar, pick it up, hold it under the arms, sense the chemical cues, and remember and open it up. And it wasn't enough to have just the chemical cues. So clearly, if you think about it, it makes an awful lot of sense. First I see it and I grab it. Now it's gone from sight. Oh, that's right, I got the chemical cues, I remember I should open it. And this is just a slide to show you this is learning. So this is first trial, second trial, third trial, fourth trial, fifth trial, morning and evening. And statistically, numbers 1 and 2 are different from 3, 4, or 5. So the octopuses learned in the sense that they were quicker to open the jar. Okay, so they're smart. Why? This is an animal. The GPO may live 3 or 4 years, but most of the other octopuses live maybe 1. Why be so smart when you live such a short time? What I think is going on is that life is tough out there, even though Cy loves it, okay? For an octopus, when you decide to go foraging, you have many possible kinds of prey. You have to decide where to go. And I've watched octopuses in the field. When they want to go out hunting, they sit by their home and they look around and they do a head bob, and then after a little while they go. But they go to a favorable area and then they search with the arms. And then they have to decide whether to take the food home or whether to eat it out. You know, life is complicated. But it's not just that life is complicated in terms of feeding. Life is complicated in terms of the fact that one of my colleagues called octopuses an unprotected package of protein. And that's the way the fish feel about it, and that's the way the crabs feel about it, and that's the way the sea otters feel about it, and that's, yeah, okay, good food. So they have to calculate how to go out, how to get what I want, and how not to be eaten. And that's a very complex thing that they have to do. Now, I think when it comes to intelligence, it's probably also a good thing to be able to manipulate the world around you. And there's absolutely no doubt that with these 8 arms, hundreds of suckers, We don't even understand the manipulative ability these animals have, but they have it, and I think it helps them to evolve the intelligence. Leading me to say that we have a non-terrestrial model of the evolution of intelligence, and the more I learn, the more I love them, and I don't really know what their intelligence is like, but I'm getting there. Thank you.
Hello. My name's David Scheel. I've been fortunate enough to be studying the giant Pacific octopus up in Alaska in these sort of North Pacific waters for about 20 years. But recently I've had a chance to do a little bit of work in a couple of other spots. One of them was this wonderful expedition with Jennifer and Cy and Keely. But I want to talk today about a little bit of work I've done on the ecology of octopuses down in Australia, and this is a different species called Octopus tetricus. And as Jennifer has just shown you, we often think about octopuses from their role as a forager in the environment and as something that might be attacked by a predator. So we think about them in terms of trophics, how the energy flows through the ecosystem. But today I want to talk a little bit about thinking about octopuses in a non-trophic manner. And one of the tools that we have as ecologists to think about this is a term that's been used, the ecosystem engineer. And an ecosystem engineer is an organism that changes the availability of resources to other species by causing state changes in materials in the environment. So it's not removing or adding food, but it's changing the way energy flows to other species by the changes that it makes in the environment. So something like a beaver who gnaws down trees to build a dam to alter the way that water flows, that's the quintessential ecosystem engineer. Well, I worked at a site in Australia where octopuses are ecosystem engineers. And the octopuses did this by excavating dens and accumulating piles of prey remains, so these shells. And these shells are not themselves food. This is the bit that gets left behind after the packaging problem. And it forms big middens. And so a midden is just a pile of remains. And I'll step away from the mic for just a second here. You can sort of see right here, there's a very large area that is a pile of shells. And the surrounding area all the way out around here is clear. This is a large wobbegong shark, and this is a little artifact, a very small thing that forms an octopus den. And we think this was the seed for this area. And octopus's den here, and then they start to leave shells. And then these are just, this is a GoPro camera on a small tripod, and another GoPro camera that we use to collect our data. And so our methods is we're out there and we do a little bit of survey work and we leave these GoPro cameras behind. Whoops. Here's the GoPro camera right here. We just leave them there. And there's rich supplies of food nearby. So you see these are scallops, which are what the octopuses are eating. And there's just a lot of them out there. And if you look near the den down here, you can see that on the shell bed itself, the availability of scallops, the scallops are depleted. They're drawn down. There's not any left. And right near the shell bed, within about 3 meters, there's a few, but not very many. But you go out about 20 meters from the shell bed, and the scallops are just everywhere. And so this is a sign that the octopuses are foraging right near home, and they're carrying the food back and piling it up in the shell bed, and that predation pressure is sufficient enough to drive down the local availability of these scallops. The shell bed, in turn, as I mentioned, it provides shelter for more octopuses. And they dig new dens that they wouldn't otherwise have in the peripheries of the shell bed. And then these octopuses, since they're all piled up together on this rather extensive midden pile, garbage pile, they begin to interact routinely on this pile. And so you can see here we have one octopus at the main artifact just reaching out and taking a little poke over here at this other octopus hiding out in the shell bed. And this happens all the time. And you get other kinds of interactions. So you get interference. Here's an octopus who picked up some shells, cleaning out his den, climbed up on top of the artifact, and deliberately dumped those shells right down here on top of the other octopus. They chase one another. You have a large octopus right here, pursuing a smaller one here. And sometimes they grapple with one another. So we have two octopuses out of their dens, and this is the artifact in the foreground. In the background, here's the mantle of one and the head of the other, and the mantle, and these are their arms and webs spread out, sort of taking each other's measure and having a bit of a fight. So on this shell bed, as the octopuses are interacting, you get this invertebrate community that develops. And so again, here I have a similar sort of graph. On the shell bed, you have quite a lot of these little guys. You get small hermit crabs and scavenging snails that come in, and there's bumblebee shrimp and blue-ringed octopuses, yet another species, lots of different kinds of very small animals living within the shell bed. And that's unique to the shell bed. If you go just a meter or two off of that shell bed, all of that disappears, and 20 meters from the shell bed, you find very little of this of any kind whatsoever. So it's very restricted to the area around the octopuses. And then the shell bed itself begins to attract fish. So this is a fish called a Fortescue, this guy here, and he's got a little parasite on his head. And if you count these guys, in I think this was a half-meter wide swath right across the shell bed, you find dozens of them on the shell bed. And a few meters away, right adjacent to the shell bed, right on the edge, there's a half dozen or so. And again, 5 or 10 meters out from the shell bed, they're just gone. And that's not just this species of fish. You see Port Jackson sharks on the shell bed, half-banded sea perch, black-saddled goatfish, bearded rock cod, scorpion fish, Fortescues, trevally, mado, Chinaman leather jackets. Dozens and dozens of species of fish living on the shell bed and almost completely absent away from it. So this is the list of species here. This is the count on the bed, and you can see it just goes from very high to occasional. And then this is the count off the bed, and this is like 2 meters off of the bed. It's just away from the bed. And it's almost always less than, sometimes none at all, almost always less than the shell bed. So all of these fish are centered right on the octopuses. The fish attract predators. And this is right on the shell bed. So here's the shell bed I showed you. Here, this is the wobbegong shark I showed you. Right here. His eye is right about there. And then these are the fish that are attracted to the shell bed. So it's really, really notable because if you swim 5 meters away, there's nothing. And the predators, in turn, limit the octopus activity. Here's the octopus. He's hiding out in his den. And he is not coming out because here's the predator. And these guys are active predators on the fish that are aggregated on the shell bed where the octopuses have left them. And this is, to give you some scale here, this is the main den. There's an octopus in here who hasn't been out for 2 days, at least not in the daylight. Here's our GoPro camera in the background, and here's this 6-foot-long wobbegong leaping up into the water to grab a fish. So the definition of the ecosystem engineer is an organism that modulates the availability of resources to other species by causing changes in where materials are. These octopuses are creating these shell beds. It's having an effect at multiple trophic levels on both benthic animals, animals that live right on the substrate, and epibenthic animals that live right above the substrate across several different phyla and many different taxa. The system is probably somewhat self-limiting because as the predators come in, they inhibit the octopuses, scare off the fish, And so that slows down the rate at which the shell bed is renewed and things aggregate. So there's probably enough trophic feedbacks, negative and positive, to modulate this thing. And if there isn't that, we're pretty sure that this site is 60 feet down. But we're pretty sure that in the winter, big waves come through and stir it up. And so we do see some disturbance to the shell bed. And that seems to limit how rich of a habitat it can be. And that's it. Thank you.
So we do have a rather impressive set of researchers and, of course, Sai, our author here. They are very accomplished and they know a great deal of things. And this is just the first stage of our fire alarm. All is fine. However, it is a great moment to see if anyone has any questions for our scientists. So if you three will come on up, come on over. And does anyone have any questions for David, Jennifer, or Sai? We do have one. Now, our microphone has stopped working. But
I want to know, with regards to intelligence, is anything like mother octopus, and then it gives birth to a baby octopus. How long do they stay?
Can you hear?
Do they like learn? Like bring it into the muscle shell? Is that something that they would go into, like other animals do? Or?
Not a
I don't think it's
bit.
working.
We didn't hear a bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's not working.
Oh, all right. Go ahead. What was the question?
So the question was regarding octopus sort of reproduction, maternity, what sort of role mothers have in those in the lives of baby octos.
Is it working now? Not yet.
Use it.
Okay. And well, come on. So the question we have is about what sort of role mother octopuses have in the lives of their babies. Do you want to take it? You want me to?
Sure.
Go ahead. Jennifer will take that one.
I don't know if the microphone's working. Good. Actually, mother octopuses are very, very vigilant about taking care of their eggs. And the GPO will take up to 6 months. She'll lay the eggs in a protected crevice, and she'll blow jets of water over them. She will run her arms down along them, and it can be, as I said, motherhood for 6 months solid. She'll protect them from any kind of predator. She'll protect them from settling algae, from fungi. Sadly, after the eggs have hatched, the babies float off in the deep blue distance, and she will die.
So there's no learning.
No.
They don't pass things on. But there is many an internet meme that suggests that if they did, octopuses would take over the world. We have a question right here.
As someone who has a lot of family in Lethbridge, I'm really interested that, Jennifer, you've become an octopus guru, since that's about the worst place I can imagine to be an octopus watcher. So I'm curious, for all of our panelists, what was your first ever experience with a live octopus?
You can repeat it into the microphone first.
Okay, as a matter of fact, my first experience with a live octopus was as a child, because I didn't grow up in Lethbridge. I grew up in Victoria, and I was fascinated by the animals of the seashore. Every time the tide was out, I was down on the beach, and I do remember seeing an octopus, and this is interesting to think about. It was a GPO, but I saw it come up out of the water and crawl across a rock and go back down into the water. I don't remember being fascinated by them at that point. It took a little bit later for me to understand how important behavior was and how much behavior these animals had and how intelligent they were. But that's my first encounter.
So my first encounter with octopuses followed actually getting a research grant to do some work on them. I had never really, I'd probably seen one in a zoo somewhere before, but not in a memorable way. But I have as Cy knows, I have a kind of a history of accepting an invitation to join an expedition and then getting out there and going, right, so where are the octopuses? And so I was actually on the beaches in Prince William Sound, and I had accepted some money to do some research there because octopuses were increasingly rare at that point in time. Folks were worried about them, and so I ended up looking for them on the beaches with folks from the village of
lions in the Serengeti to octopuses in Alaska. That's how flexible David is.
They're both predators.
Okay, do we have any? Oh, look at this.
Oh, now we have.
Fancy. And thank you for your patience with our technical difficulties. Are there any other questions? All right, well, if you're worried about asking questions in this larger group, don't worry. In just a few moments, we'll be making our way outside. For those of you that are here on site, we've got books available. They can be signed by these lovely, experienced, prolific people. You can ask them questions at that point as well. And of course, the two books again are Cy's adult nonfiction, The Soul of an Octopus, and the Scientists in the Field, The Octopus Scientists. So Cy is actually the author that began this Scientists in the Field series of books. So feel free to meet us there outside if you're joining us online. Of course, these books are available online, or if you visit the aquarium a little bit later on, they should be available in our gift shop as well. But thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us here as part of our Sea Monsters Revealed talks. And of course, keep in mind that our next big event is this Saturday, World Oceans Day. Please come and celebrate it right here at the Vancouver Aquarium. So thanks so much, everyone, and have a fantastic rest of your morning.